Okay, we are live this morning. I want to first welcome the Prince Hall family and welcome all of our guests and all of our viewers today to our virtual town hall on the subject of 21st century police reform. Uh, First off, to introduce our guests, I would like to introduce you all to our most worshipful Grand Master, the Honorable Emmanuel J. Stanley.
Thank you, Terrence. Good morning and welcome to the viewing and listening audience. We thank you for joining us in this important discussion on police reform in the 21st century. I am pleased to have a dynamic group of panelists who have a track record of addressing a number of challenges facing our society and who are on the front lines for progress and positive change. To that end, I am pleased to have the Honorable Benjamin S. Cardin, the senior senator representing the great state of Maryland. Senator Cardin is the ranking member on a number of Senate committees and subcommittees, to include but are not limited to the Senate Committee on Finance, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship, the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and also the Helsinki Commission. Moreover, he is not new to the efforts to reform policing and to correct a broken system that underserves our communities. He is the author and sponsor of 2 bills which specifically address our topic, and I am confident that he will share their content as well as enlighten us on the current state of the U.S. Congress. We also have the Honorable Aisha Braveboy. She's a former state delegate for Maryland's 25th Legislative District, and she is the current state's attorney for Prince George's County, Maryland. In the House of Delegates, she served on the House Economic Matters Committee and chaired the Consumer Protection Subcommittee. She was the chair of the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus and a member of Maryland's Women's Caucus. Her reputation is cemented in the community. The citizens have confidence in her, which is why she secured 98.7% of the vote to obtain her current position. She is a woman of integrity. She lives up to her agency's mission statement, which is to seek justice for all through firm, fair, and consistent prosecutions with the highest level of integrity and professionalism. Next, we have the president of the NAACP Maryland State Conference, the Honorable Willie Flowers, who is also dual-hatted as the president of the Howard County NAACP chapter. He's a champion for the people and their civil rights. Mr. Flowers is known throughout the state as a voice who has long since been calling for change and the necessity to revisit police training in urban and suburban communities. Earlier this year, he wrote in the Afro the following: "There's clearly a need to revisit police training, even in suburban areas. It is apparent that there is a need for implicit bias training, an understanding of restorative practice in street policing, the development of the skill of embracing community policing in suburban communities, and clearly there's a disconnect between police and the neighborhoods they are supposed to serve well. Training on new policies and best practices need to be implemented and should be prioritized by law enforcement leadership. The community and the police need to collaborate on restoring trust and to redefine the role of the police." Not only has he made his own statement, I'm sure that he will speak to the national NAACP's initiative and their document, which is Pathways to Police Reform and Community Mobilization Toolkit. Soon to join us will be the president and CEO of the Greater Baltimore Urban League, the Honorable Tiffany Majors. She had a conflict. She'll be joining us momentarily. She leads the Baltimore chapter of the Historic Urban League, which has served as a safe haven for marginalized communities, which helps them to receive needed educational and job training. Ms. Majors, recently in a Afro newspaper, it was stated that she is beautiful, educated, and altruistic. Tiffany Majors has spent her life dedicating her time and efforts to serving the forgotten and unprivileged in Maryland. Over a span of 2 decades, Ms. Majors continues to focus her attention to the many trials that plague the Black community. Challenges such as housing, employment, healthcare, and the penal system are on the agenda, and she refuses to back down. As president and CEO of the Greater Baltimore Urban League, Majors has led the charge in the battle to create a more equitable tomorrow. And as soon as she joins us, I'm sure she will enlighten us not only to her efforts in the city of Baltimore, but also to address the national 10-point plan, which has been put forth by the Honorable Mark Muriel, who is the president of the National Urban League. With that, I will turn it back over to you, Terrence, and we can get started.
Yes, sir. Most worshipful sir. Thank you for those introductions. I would like to go around to our guests so that they can have some opening comments. We'll begin with Senator Ben Cardin. Good morning to you.
Well, Terrence, first of all, thank you very much, Most Worshipful Grandmaster. Thank you for your leadership. We appreciate this opportunity. It's great to be here. Aisha Braveboy, the great work that she's doing in Prince George's County. Willie Flowers, a dear friend. We've worked on many issues together. So you have a distinguished group here to talk about policing. Yesterday was a good day in the House of Representatives, a great day in the House of Representatives, with the Justice and Policing Act was passed. That provides major change in policing in America and holding those police officers who violate the trust accountable for their actions. But it was a sad week in that the United States Senate, under the leadership of Mitch McConnell, decided that it would go a partisan route to try to check a box rather than get something done. And the bill that they brought to the floor, I was proud to vote against it and to stop it, along with all of the major groups supporting reform in policing. And let me tell you why. Let me tell you why we would not allow this charade to go forward in the United States Senate. The bill they brought to the floor was a partisan bill. It didn't deal with the fundamental systemic problems that we have in law enforcement in our country. We've seen way too many examples of the George Floyds, the Freddie Grays, those who've lost their life as a result of police violating the trust. So the bill they brought to the floor did not include key elements of the Justice and Policing Act. The Justice and Policing Act includes legislation that I filed that would end discriminatory racial and religious profiling. That needs to end in America. It's still present. Police are still targeting minority communities for special types of surveillance. This needs to end. It causes loss of life. It causes waste of resources, and it turns neighborhoods against police working together. We saw that in the Freddie Gray example, what happened, and we know that this type of practice needs to end. We know about the talk. That has to end in America. The bill they brought to the Senate floor did not include another bill that I filed, the Law Enforcement Integrity and Trust Act, to make sure that we have national standards for what is proper action by law enforcement. We end the chokehold once and for all, that we have standards on the use of force so that we require police officers to be measured in the way that they respond to circumstances rather than using deadly force as they have used way, way too often. Body cameras for police is required. National data so that we can know when a police officer has violated the trust, so that if that person tries to get a job in another jurisdiction, they can get that information. That's not included in the bill that was brought to the Senate floor. No-knock warrants were not included in the bill that was brought to the Senate floor. It was basically a bill that did very little so that the Senate Republicans could say they had done something. We're not going to let that happen. It's time for fundamental change in this country. We know that we need to deal with this in policing. That's the topic today. But make no mistake about it. Related subjects of discrimination in this country and lack of justice, you could go to healthcare, you could go to wealth and economics, you could go to housing. We need to make a firm commitment that America truly will be a country of equal opportunity for all communities and all individuals. And that's what this is about. And this fight, we're not going to give up. We see so many protests in this country. Look at who's protesting, a diversified group of Americans. We all get it. And it's beyond our shores. We see global engagement on this issue because they know America needs to be the leader on social justice. And we need to change fundamentally the way that our police departments are organized.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. And with that, we will go to the Honorable Aisha Braveboy for her opening remarks.
Thank you so much for having me. And most worshipful Grand Master, it is an honor and privilege for you to allow me to have this forum. And Terrence, thank you so much for moderating. My good friend, Senator Ben Cardin, thank you for always speaking to truth. And because oftentimes it is a rubber stamp that people are looking to say, I've checked the box. And we have to hold everyone accountable. And of course, to my good friend, Willie Flowers, who I've known for a long time, your leadership over the NAACP is extraordinary. And we're going to do great work, especially in Annapolis this year. I know that we have a lot of work to do around legislation to improve our criminal justice system here. But what I will say, and I'll be brief because I know you all have a lot of questions for us. What I will say is that what the lessons of the past few weeks have taught us is that increasingly, and I have said this in my office, we are not simply administrators of punishment, but we have to be problem solvers for our community. Sometimes that involves prosecutions, but sometimes it involves diversion, treatment, and compassion. And not only is that important for prosecutors to look at themselves as problem solvers, but increasingly we need our police officers also to look at themselves as problem solvers. And sometimes, depending on the nature of the offense and the criminal history of that individual who they are encountering, the best way to solve the problem may be an arrest that day. But sometimes it requires officers to exercise compassion and to recognize that sometimes people need other types of help and intervention. But what we have to do as a society is give them those options. Instead of taking someone to a jail, perhaps taking them to a treatment center. If they're homeless, instead of taking them to jail because they've trespassed or they've committed a fourth-degree burglary, which is breaking into an unoccupied space. And oftentimes homeless people do that to have a warm place to sleep at night. Instead of taking them to jail, maybe they could take them to either a shelter or a safe housing location. But again, that requires us as society to invest in those social safety nets that people need. And so I'm excited about this conversation because I think it'll move us in a better direction, but we must put in place humanity back in both policing and in prosecution. I think we'll have better interactions with civilians, and I think that the community will ultimately be safer. So thank you so much. I look forward to being able to respond to many of your questions today. And again, I appreciate the leadership of the Masons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, State's Attorney Braveboy. We're already getting lots of comments on our Facebook and on our YouTube channel. In fact, one of our worshipful masters, Mr. Chris Lewis L., he says the only way things will change is if we actively change them together. And that is the reason that we're on this call today. So with that in mind, we will go to Mr. Willie Flowers for his opening remarks.
Good morning. I want to thank everybody for being on the call. Certainly want to acknowledge the worshipful Master Stanley. Do great work. This is amazing coming from the position of Prince Hall Lodge. I tell the story, the NAACP likes to say anecdotally that the NAACP is the largest and oldest civil rights organization, but I have to be reminded that the Masons came first. I also want to let people know that some of the first stories I heard about, if you got pulled over by the police, if you got pulled over and got in some trouble, you can show your card, traveling card for the Masons, or you can show your NAACP cards. So I got both of them. And I joined the Masons and I joined the NAACP. And I want to thank Terrence for bringing this technology because it's very important. I'd like to say also that when this thing about civil rights and all this, you got to be concerned about foreign, domestic, and you can add cyber to that these days because you can get attacked from a cyber standpoint. And it seems like you brothers are pulling it together to protect that. And Senator Cardinal, thank you for being here. This really shows an energy toward trying to meet people where they are. And that's significant when you get into a large position like yours, and some people don't even do that. So I commend you for that work. And Aisha Brave Boy, the state's attorney, I remember when this sister was, I don't know, you were working in the community outreach person. And many years ago, it's probably around 2002, and now she's a state's attorney. So that just goes you to show that when you do the stuff at the grassroots level, it can pay off big time. You can do good work. And she's certainly nestled into the challenges in not just Prince George's County, because she gets around the entire state. So we look for great things moving forward. I want to remind everybody that sometimes we get away from what the real issue is. And I know that the police are kind of the focus, because the police are 24 hours, they work 24 hours. They, are always visible. And, if we all had a job that we work 24 hours, we'd be filmed too. But they have cameras on them, and outside, inside, and all that kind of stuff. So they get the focus. But I do think that while we need to work with the police, and I certainly double down on community and police relations, I think that's significant. It should be a noble part of it. But we also got to talk about this thing that causes this, and that's systemic racism. And if we leave this out of the conversation, the police can be reformed, healed, whatever you call it, reconciled, and we'll still have these many challenges in our systems because of systemic racism that will continue to exist. And if we don't deal with that, then we're going to be stuck. Now, I'm proud to say that in Howard County, and my experience with the police has been, challenging, because I lived in Baltimore for a while. And during that period of time, Baltimore was unrelenting about their focus on being tough on crime and all that. And I became a victim of that. I don't like to say the word victim, because you don't get out of it. I had an experience that inspired me to dedicate myself to the NAACP. And that experience had me in central booking for 6 hours. And it was not a good experience, but it showcased that there was overreach by the police. And I'm trying to editorialize this to get to my point. The point was that I could have taken that bitterness, anger that I had. I was so bitter and angry that on the rough ride to central booking, I decided to leave that city. We moved away from the city. But when I became the president of the NAACP in 2017, I couldn't take that venom feeling of being a victim and all that in leadership. And I had to make a intentional decision to figure out how to work and collaborate with the police. And I think Howard County was the best place for that. Well, it didn't matter, but I just happened to be in Howard County. And since then, we have worked together over the last 4 years, built a very strong relationship between the NAACP and the Howard County Police. It has reduced and mitigated a lot of challenges and I had to learn that the police work by investigations. And if there's an open investigation, you can't say anything. So I had to learn that. But the point is that there were many things mitigated that could have been explosive in crisis situations, but because we were working together, they didn't happen. In addition to that, we do an annual flag football game with the police, which creates opportunity for you to connect. We perform something called the 22-a-day push-up challenge that started out talking about PTSD and military veterans, but when we did it with the police, they said that the police have PTSD also. So these types of things were discovered. We worked together, and last year we finally did a golf tournament in collaboration with Howard County Police and the police unions, I want to add, because there's always this feeling that the police unions are more rigid than the police. But we raised $20,000 for youth programming in Howard County for young people. And I lay all that out to say that I think that that's the beginning point for us. And now we can move to talking about policy, because if you can't have a relationship with someone, and everybody on this panel knows that you can't force them to do any policy that it's going to change the way they see things, if they do things, if they don't see it the same way. So I think that the goal should be collaboration. The goal should be working together with the police and the community, so we can heal some of these challenges in the community. But I think it starts with understanding the power of systemic racism and the history of white supremacy in it. Thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you so much, Mr. Flowers, for that intro statement, and thank you for all the great work you're doing. We would like to go directly into our moderated discussion portion. We have a number of questions coming in, and we're going to encourage our social media network commenters to continue to keep the questions going. Our first question is from Jay Glenn, and it says, what are actions that citizens can take or things we can do to get involved in progress and contribute to police reform? That was kind of echoed by Christopher Lewis L., who mentioned, what can we do as citizens to ensure the passage of the bill in the Senate? So I would like to start with Senator Cardin, and maybe you could address some of those concerns. Thank you.
Well, it's a great question. We hear that question frequently. So let me tell you, stay involved, stay focused on the issue. Let me just go back on some of the explosive issues that we've seen over the last year and a half with gun violence. And we saw students engaged, we saw the citizens engaged, and we thought we were going to get major gun safety legislation passed. But then the headlines changed, there was a news story, and we went on to do something different than that. We have to recognize that the current leadership of the United States Senate under Leader McConnell will bury these issues if he can. But if the public outrage is sufficient, he cannot do that because his members will insist that these issues be brought up for action. So we need to sustain the type of community involvement that we've seen all over this country after the George Floyd tragic murder. We got to make sure that we continue this focus and say, no, we're not going to end the debate now and go on to another subject. We're going to keep this before us. Willie Flowers is absolutely right. It's systemic racism that has caused the issue. The policing is part of that problem. We could go beyond that, but we have a chance right now to make a fundamental change in policing in this country. The bill introduced in the Senate by Senator Harris and Booker is a reasonable bill. Let's debate it. So I think stay engaged, make sure that your legislators understand that this issue is not going away. You're not going to accept a stalemate that's been created by Mitch McConnell. Let's get this issue up for vote, get those letters out, do your emails, continue the protests, and we can make progress.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Cardin. And I want to kind of pass the same question to State's Attorney Braveboy about how can citizens get involved when it comes to police accountability and police reform more on the local level.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of what I think we can accomplish on the local level because of the dynamics politically will probably be far greater in some ways than what can be accomplished on the national level. And so while I hope and I will pray that a very meaningful bill comes out of Congress, we have responsibilities right here in our state as well as our local governments to ensure that we're doing all that we can to promote accountability, responsibility, and smart policing. And so I know that there are and has historically been efforts in Annapolis to pass legislation that would provide for greater transparency with respect to police-involved use of force issues. There has been, efforts to restrict certain types of policing, like certain types of tactics used by law enforcement, include up to and including the type of equipment they can purchase. And so there's a lot of work being done right now at the state level. Our speaker, our first African-American female speaker, Adrienne Jones, put together a work group on policing reform. And they are going to be making some proposals to the General Assembly. So listening in on those discussions and also participating and commenting on those discussions are important, but also looking at what your local governments may also be doing. Often local governments have what's called citizen complaint oversight panels or some type of citizen involved review of policing policies, as well as police use of force complaints. Giving those civilian review boards more power, more authority, more ability to investigate. So those are some things that we could, as a community, push for right now. And because, again, of the dynamics in our state, we have a lot of progressive, or I consider them, just right thinking. When I say right thinking, I don't mean politically right. I mean people who are willing to say what is right and do what's right. So we have a lot of people who are looking for solutions, who are not tied into the old way of doing things, who understand that there has to be change. And in fact, it would be, I think, important to even engage with your local police department and your police unions, because they are supposed to be serving, you. They're here to serve you. And the truth is, they also understand that this is a new day and that things cannot and will not go back, and that policing will never be the same. It will never be the same, and certainly not in a state like Maryland. So I think there's an opportunity for individuals who want to get involved at their very local level, whether it's in a city or a county, or at the state level in some of the criminal justice reform proposals, or even proposing reforms yourself. I think oftentimes we're waiting, and as citizens, sometimes you wait to see what your local elected official might propose, but the truth is they are there to serve you. And you have to also provide ideas of what you think would be a better best practices in terms of policing your communities. So there's a lot of opportunity right now, and I think we can make a lot of progress here in Maryland.
Thank you so much, State's Attorney. And while we're on that subject, I want to go to our Most Worshipful Grand Master and discuss, how Prince Hall Masons can get involved and remain involved.
Well, thank you, Terrence. I think it's important for Prince Hall Masons, as well as the Eastern Stars, to be actively involved in your communities. The first thing you can do is vote, not just in presidential elections. You need to participate in every election that takes place within your municipality, your city, or within the state. It's important to pay attention to who's on the ballot. Not just during a presidential election, but understand who the mayors are. These are the ones who recommend police chiefs for their city, which affects how communities are policed. We need to pay attention to who is running for state's attorney. What is their record for prosecutions and how they deal with the various crimes that are brought before them. Are they serving the needs of the community? And if not, perhaps a change is needed. We also need to pay attention to the judges. Very often judges are on the ballot and they go uncontested. No one wants to be a judge for some reason, but I recommend that we encourage our children to go to law school, as you did, and our state's attorney, Brave Boy, become members of the bar, and then place your name in ballot to be a judge so you can affect the outcome of some of these trials. So that's what I say, be involved. Be involved. It's more than just going to the ballot box, but afterwards, then you have to stay engaged and understand what the problems are and reach out to those who you have elected. They must be held accountable. Many of them have platforms and promises that they make to the citizens, but who is checking them on that? And that's up to us to pay attention to what they ran on, what we believed in, which sparked us to support them in their effort to hold whatever office that they wanted to achieve. So we must stay engaged. And that is something that historically in our communities, we do not. We elect a person and then we leave them on their own. So not only must we hold them accountable, we must also support them when they're doing a great job.
Thank you, Most Worshipful Grand Master. And on that note, I want to go back to Senator Cardin with some questions that we have. We have some more broad questions. So first, we want to start with, are you in support of banning racial profiling tactics within police departments? We know you've done lots of work, over the years on this, and we just want to hear, some of your stances when it comes to that. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question. The answer is absolutely. I'm for banning all forms of discriminatory profiling, including racial profiling. I've introduced legislation now for the last 3 or 4 Congresses to do this. I am the lead sponsor in the United States Senate on national legislation that would ban discriminatory profiling, not just at the federal level, but that the federal, state, local, and auxiliary police, so that any individual that's under the authority of any police could not use discriminatory profiling. Let me just define that. If you have individual identifiers on a particular crime, you can use that. But when you target a neighborhood, you target a community because it's an African American community or a Muslim community, that is discriminatory policing, and that must end. The legislation I've introduced allows for private action to enforce that. It requires training. It requires statistical information so that we know how law enforcement, how police departments are going about their surveillance, how they're going about their traffic stops, how they're going about their daily business to make sure that they're not doing discriminatory profiling. So I am absolutely against profiling. It has caused communities to not work with police. We saw that in Sandtown with Freddie Gray when I talked to the leaders of that community. The community leaders in Sandtown want their community to be safe, but they felt if they worked with police, it would end up being worse than better for their community. So profiling is again, it's wasting resources. It doesn't keep communities safer, and it can be deadly.
Thank you, Senator. So a question for the NAACP for Mr. Flowers. The NAACP has a long history of battling for justice through the court systems. How is the NAACP prepared to engage in the legal fight to end structural and societal racism? And how can other organizations partner? How can individuals volunteer and or donate? So just a series of questions for you, Mr. Flowers.
That's like a softball question. So join the NAACP, donate to the NAACP, and get involved in the programming. Regardless of your county, there's a branch in 24 counties. We're in every county except Garrett. And we're trying to change that. Again, it's important to us. Everything mentioned here is important. At the top level, you got to worry about the federal stuff. You certainly got to worry about the state stuff. But all of this starts in the community. We say that the police and the fire and all these guys are the first responders. Well, the first responders are the people in the communities, those community leaders, those grandmamas, all these people are the folks. And if we stay in touch with all of these individuals who are the first line of defense, the first line of support, the first line of concern, that's what makes our community. And the NAACP is made up of all those people. We're not a sophisticated a corporate organization. We are a volunteer grassroots organization. And all of these issues starts at the grassroots level. And you can be a part of it. Nothing that we've talked about racial profiling, and I think 1996 presidential debate is an example. I'm sorry, I take that back. That was a 2000 presidential debate. If anybody remembers that Democratic debate, the number one issue was racial profiling in the Democratic primary because of issues that happened in New Jersey. Our candidate in the Democratic general election did not win. And when we got into what happened with 9/11, we basically legalized racial profiling because of 9/11. That was a very small grassroots issue. We stay focused on the issues together. When they get to a higher federal level, they don't lose the sensitivity they have. One thing that we can apply to this conversation, and that we're trying to apply around this conversation about policing, particularly in schools, is that law enforcement at the grassroots level becomes not just social work, but it also becomes human services. And they need to be empowered to do that work better than they do, because if they're only trained to be police, the obligation they have to do social work and human services gets lost. So we got to stay focused at the grassroots level and articulate this up. So when we're making big legislation, it doesn't get lost. So just stay at the local level.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers, for that answer. And so next I want to go to our state's attorney to ask a question that's really been burning on the minds of a lot of our Prince George's County natives. So first, we just want to talk about how will officers who engage in inequitable treatment of minorities or who conduct illegal profiling be prosecuted? And when we say that, we just want to know if you could outline the process for prosecuting such a police officer with whom your office may work closely. You know, what issues could arise from that, and under what circumstances would a special prosecutor be necessary?
Well, let me just say in my office, everyone's very clear. There's one set of rules that apply to everyone, and no one's above the law, period. And so we prosecute police officers. We do so effectively. And it is my responsibility to protect everyone in this community, including those who are unfairly brutalized by police officers. And I take that role very seriously. With respect to our relationship with the police department, certainly we partner as we investigate cases and as we try to hold individuals accountable for their actions in our community. But while we have a working relationship, my responsibility is to hold them accountable too. And they understand that. And I'm in the best position to do it. And I tell you why. Because when I see cases where I believe that the police have exercised poor judgment and have arrested or overcharged residents here in the community, we oftentimes dismiss those charges. And through my prosecutions and what we choose to prosecute, we send a message on what we will tolerate in this community. And so where we see people on a routine traffic stop being charged with resisting arrest and assault on a police officer after an interaction where the police officer may have behaved badly, we don't move forward with those cases. We dismiss those charges against those civilians in our community. And we also look at it as an opportunity to teach and train our officers to enforce the law more appropriately in our community. You know, being in this role, it is dynamic. When I say it's dynamic, you have a lot of responsibilities, a lot of power, but also your duty is great. But our ultimate duty is to do justice. And if I have cases brought to me by officers who I can't trust, I can't try them. That's simple as that, because we cannot put and allow officers who we believe have discriminated against people or have used unfair tactics against our residents, we cannot use them on the stand. And we don't. And so when a special prosecutor might be needed would be when there is a direct conflict with our office. And that has, since I have been there, has not occurred. So all of the police prosecutions that we have done with our my staff. My staff is very effective. I have some of the best prosecutors in the state, probably in the country. And so I don't want to put on someone else the responsibility that I know that my office has and that I know that we can perform effectively. So we have prosecuted officers successfully. We have a number of indictments for very serious offenses committed by not just Prince George's County police officers, but we have 26 municipalities, and we also have other policing agencies that operate in our county. And so we also look at their actions, and we bring cases against officers in some of these other policing agencies that have committed use of force issues or other just criminal issues in our community. But from my perspective, I just have to do my job. And I've done that. And I think every prosecutor has the responsibility to do their job effectively, to work with police where you can, but also to hold them accountable. And that's just the job of the prosecutor. And we should not look at taking that responsibility away from the prosecutor, because we are responsive to you. You elect us to do a job. And if we put that responsibility off on someone else, what that says is that the citizens, you don't have a voice in how that special prosecutor or whoever may be brought in to prosecute those cases. You don't have a choice on the decisions that they make. You can't influence them. You can't hold them responsible. You can't remove them if you don't like how they're doing their job. That is just a responsibility that the state's attorneys must have to exercise. And unless there is a direct conflict, then it is the responsibility of my office to prosecute those cases, and we do so effectively.
Terrence, if I could jump in, and ask our panelists, because I heard the opening statements from Senator Cardin and the several comments from State's Attorney Braveboy. I'm just wondering, what is the impact of training for police officers? There's been a great deal of emphasis put on it. Every time we have one of these incidents, we talk about training. Mr. Flowers talked about implicit bias training. In most agencies, I work in the federal arena. We do training throughout the year. We have ethics training. We get trained on fair treatment of others, and this is at least annually. My understanding is that most police departments, their training has to deal with how to protect themselves, use of their firearms and equipment, but there's very little other training that goes on. What are your thoughts on how to improve the training for our police force to hopefully eliminate some of the biases that exist? Anyone?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So go ahead.
Senator?
Well, I think it starts with how we screen those individuals who want to be a part of our police force. Oftentimes we are screening for things like, have you ever smoked marijuana? Have you ever committed, even a petty crime, versus, what kind of groups do you belong to? Do you have any bias? Have you ever been involved with a racist, organization? What are your views on different types of people? Like, these are the questions that need to be asked, and individuals need to be evaluated before they get on the police department on their biases. Okay, so that's the first thing that I think is important. In addition to that, you can't teach someone not to be racist if that's what they want to be. Okay, so I think we have to understand that people who are racist choose to be racist. Now, there are people with biases based on maybe their experience growing up or other things. So they may have a view of a certain person based on their experience or based on what they have been told. And those individuals perhaps their minds can be shaped through the process of training and getting them, acclimated in the community. That is a possibility. But again, I think that everyone has their biases. So I'm not suggesting that everyone who's on a police department can't have bias, because the truth is we all have our biases. And I think it's unfair to kind of put on them, something that all of us have. But when I say we have biases versus racism, we may look at someone a certain way based on our experience, but how we treat them, I think, determines whether or not we can be fair in how we administer justice. And so what I believe happens is oftentimes you have people who are absolutely racist on departments. They have no interest or capacity to want to treat people fairly, but they get to move up through the ranks because they are able to pass the test. They make the arrest, they perform well, but again, they are not serving our communities appropriately. So screening out people is extremely important. And then the training is critical. Oftentimes you get that intensive training when you're in the police academy, but when you go out on the street, it's a whole different ball game, and you're not consistently, even though they have in-service, the in-service training is not as intensive as the training that officers get when they initially join the department, which is understandable. But the problem is they don't have those encounters until after they go through their training academy, and then they have encounters on the street. And then they may not have the ability, the capacity, the understanding on how to address people on the street. And so they need additional training. So we are proposing, we've sent a letter to our county executive as well as copying our police department on a very comprehensive training that our office would like to give on constitutional policing, the 4th and 5th Amendment, use of force, and then also talk through to them what we don't accept in terms of charging when police overcharge people and why, so that they understand what the expectation of the state's attorney's office is going to be, because ultimately they bring those cases to us. We decide whether or not we're going to try those cases, and where we see officers who have, we may believe, exercise, racism or bias or unfair treatment, we don't have to try those cases, and we don't. We have dismissed several cases where we believe, the civilian, for one reason or another, was not treated appropriately. Their constitutional rights may have been violated, or the officer may have been unprofessional. And so there's no way we want to support officers acting in a way that's unprofessional. And we do that by sending messages through what we accept for prosecution and what we don't.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator, is training being addressed in the Senate bill?
Yes, we do. The Senate bill does not address training. The Justice and Policing Act does address training. And let me just underscore this point. I think State's Attorney Brayboy is absolutely correct. It starts with screening, making sure that the individuals that are being that apply to become police officers have the background and do not have factors that would make it difficult for them to use this power fairly. So it starts with screening. Then you need to have standards. You need to have clear standards of what you expect a police officer to do. These are professionals applying for a professional position. So there has to be clear standards on the use of force. There's got to be clear standards on how policing is done from the point of view of investigatory work, so that they understand what discriminatory profiling is all about. There's got to be standards as to how they go about stopping individuals for traffic stops. And then there's got to be, as part of training, not just how you deal with those circumstances from the point of view of best practices by law enforcement, but you need to be out in the community as part of training. So you understand the sensitivity that communities of color have in regards to law enforcement, so that you're sensitized to that before you go into a community, and I think it was the state's attorney also mentioned, you need to understand how to de-escalate a circumstance. That needs to be very clear as part of training. You have to understand that sometimes law enforcement get involved in issues that really shouldn't be law enforcement. It should be health officials taking care of the circumstances, or housing officials, or it shouldn't be someone with a badge. So you need to know how you back off and get the right services into a community to avoid a conflict situation. That's all part of adequate training. And then lastly, you need to have data. You need to know what's going on. You need to be able to evaluate as to whether that police officer is following the training, following the standards, and if not, there's got to be accountability.
Thank you for those answers. Now, we have another question for the senator. This one comes from Worshipful Master Ed White from Universal Lodge in Annapolis, where we just had an outstanding Juneteenth march. Worshipful Master White says, Senator Cardin, I acknowledge that it is great that the House has passed what appears to be an effective police reform bill, but multiple sources are now reporting that the bill lacks bipartisan consensus. Do you feel the House and Senate are likely to negotiate an effective police reform bill prior to the presidential election?
Well, it's a great question. I hope we do. In my heart, I recognize that this is an opportunity to make a fundamental change. The American people want us to do it. So from a political point of view, it's what we should do. From a policy point of view, it's what we should be doing. The international community is looking at us to see how the leader in democracy and human rights respond to the current circumstances. So I hope that will allow the bipartisan product to come forward. In the Senate, we operate best when we work across party line to get things done. And I know there's a lot of outreach being done right now by not only my office, not only by me, but by Senator Harris and Senator Booker and others who are trying to find that coalition that will bring a bill to the floor. But I must tell you, that's how my heart feels. But looking at the experiences that we've had in this Congress with Leader McConnell, looking at how many bills, bipartisan bills, have passed the House of Representatives and have died in the legislative graveyard of the United States Senate, since one person decides what is brought to the floor, and that's Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader. Unless we continue the public outrage, unless we continue to keep focused on this issue, I'm afraid that Leader McConnell will try to delay this until after the elections. I think we need to make it clear that's unacceptable, that we need to take advantage of the momentum we have right now, and we need to pass meaningful reform. It should be bipartisan. I agree with that. It's not going to be written by one party, but I think if we get together, we can pass a meaningful bill.
Senator, I know Terrence wants to move on. He's moderating. Thank you for that response. The average citizen, especially in minority communities, are quite confused by what's going on in the Congress. There have been multitude of videos, even since the George Floyd murder, that have surfaced. And just yesterday, coming out of Wilmington, North Carolina, we had a situation where 3 officers were fired for their racism. This appears to be, in the minority community, to be a state of emergency. And so we don't understand the politics associated with the delays. A lack of action means that there will be more deaths without accountability. Those who don't live in Senator McConnell's state have obviously no influence on him. So we don't know how to apply the proper pressure to make this happen so that we can save lives. And that's what we're looking for. This has nothing to do with red or blue or what your political affiliation is. This has to do with saving lives. And it would seem to me that everyone in the Congress would be interested in doing just that. Can you explain to us why that is not the case?
Well, Grandmaster, your original response to how individuals can get involved by voting was right on. That's the fundamental. We should never miss an opportunity to express ourselves at the polls. And this election could be the most critical in our lifetime. So when you say if you don't live in Kentucky, you can't influence Mitch McConnell, let me disagree with that. Mitch McConnell can only be the Republican leader if he has a majority of United States senators that are elected in November. there are 1/3 of the United States senators are up for election this November. Now, Maryland does not have a Senate seat open, but there are Senate seats open in 1/3 of the seats, or 2/3 of the Senate, 2/3 of the states. So you can influence Mitch McConnell by making it clear to the Senate election in your state that this issue must be addressed now. You can't wait till November. If you wait till November, you're not going to be back in the Senate. Get on and get this done. So there are at least a dozen states that have Republican incumbents or open seats where this is a very, very much a key issue where we can make progress and we can get it done. So we're hoping over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be in session this week, and then we're off for the July 4 recess. We hope when we come back, there'll be pressure that will have mounted that from his Republican colleagues that will demand that this bill come up. And let me just make this final point. We're prepared to have a bipartisan bill. We know it won't be identical to what passed the House. We recognize that. We need to negotiate it. But the bill that they brought up this past week was a disgrace. It didn't do anything. We need to have a base bill that we can be proud of, that hopefully we have an open amendment process. We'll let the will of the Senate prevail. But at the end of the day, we have a bill that makes progress, makes significant progress. And if we get that, I'll proudly vote for it, even if it doesn't include all the provisions I would like to see there. So that's what we're trying to get the political focus on. And quite frankly, our partner groups, the groups for civil rights, the NAACP, all those groups are with us in this strategy, because we don't want this opportunity to pass without meaningful reform.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And I got word that Mr. Flowers wanted to chime in on training, police training.
Well, I mean, the training, I think, is important. The discussion about screening is extremely important. One thing I learned about Howard County's structure is that you have to have some level of college. I think you have to have at least an associate's on your way to an associate's to be a part of that police district. And I think that's kind of part of the screening process. I'm not saying that education is the only way, because you obviously can hire people who are not just racist. Some people are just bullies. And I think that should be a part of the training too. If you have some, we know these people, if you've ever played sports, you ever done anything in groups, those people show their face very early. And when they identify that they're gonna be racist, they're gonna be xenophobic, they're gonna be homophobic, and some people just don't like fat people. I have a challenge with people who smoke. That's a bias. But you have to train people that those things have to be de-escalated in you, so that you can do what you're supposed to do as a person who is paid by the public to administer justice.
Thank you.
Along those lines, I would ask our panelists, what can be done in the state of Maryland, particularly with the Maryland Police Training Committee, which is the governing body for police training, to have more diversity and accountability from that organization?
I think it's already been said. I think this model, I mean, the model of the, I guess they used to call them officer friendly, but the SROs are an example. I think that one piece of what the school resource officers do is that they're consistently with, just like the teachers, they're with the students all the time. So they play a significant role in mentoring and guiding. I think they can be people who can direct young people toward a career in law enforcement. And quite frankly, there's nothing wrong with a noble career. I don't, again, I guess I don't follow the notion that all police are bad, just like I don't follow the notion that the military is bad or anything else. I follow the notion that an individual who has the right purpose in their mind, if they're guided and trained, they can be superb members of any system. And in this case, in the discussion about police, I think that police are the best people to recruit other police officers, and good police officers can inspire the future of law enforcement. And that's kind of something that should be focused on, and let the cream rise to the top.
Thank you. And we want to pause just for a moment because we have now on the line Ms. Tiffany Majors, who's the president and CEO of the Greater Baltimore Urban League. Ms. Majors, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you so much for joining us. I know your schedule has been busy. So let me start with the question that I already posed to Mr. Flowers. The Urban League has a long history of fighting for legal justice and just equal justice through the courts and otherwise. What are some ways that an average citizen or a member of the Prince Hall family could get involved with you guys? And could we volunteer? Could we donate? What are some things we could do to get involved with the Urban League?
Oh, absolutely. Please. We love support. 90% of our work is run through volunteers and our sponsorship donations. You can reach us by logging on to our website, which is gbul.org. And you can log on there. You can become a member there. We have 2 different auxiliaries, which is our guild, and that's for members that are 41 and over. And then our young professionals, which is also known as GBLA, Greater Baltimore Leadership Association, and they are 40 and under. And both auxiliaries support our organization. As you know, Greater Baltimore Urban League, we provide hands-on direct services, and we provide services to the youth in our Saturday Leadership Program, which is college and career readiness. We serve over 140 students right now, and our students originally all came from Baltimore City, but we now have students that travel from New Jersey, Washington, D.C., and Virginia that participate in our Saturday Leadership Program. And that's a program where students, 140 show up on one Saturday per month, and we meet at a different college where they will sit with the admissions director and a panel of students that will discuss their matriculation into the college life, financial literacy, as well as sexual orientation, classes, careers, and choosing your courses. We usually attend 10 different schools every year, and they're a different school. If it's a HBCU, we meet with a panel of students. If it's a PWI, then we ask that we can have a mixed panel, preferably students that look like our students. Our students come from Baltimore City schools. They come from Boys Latin, Calvert Hall, Howard County, as well as Washington, D.C., and we also have a parent university at the same time. So when the students are there at the college, their parents are there as well. And we have, in a different area, a parent university where we will meet with the parents and discuss financial literacy, the admissions process, journaling, essay, and so forth. As far as our other programs, we are entering into a commitment next month with Truist, who is, BB&T and SunTrust, where we will provide a workforce development program for the reentry population. As you're aware, with this COVID, we have a lot of individuals that are being early released from prison. And unfortunately, they're released without the resources and tools to become successful and sustain that. So we are beginning a partnership with Truist to begin a workforce development program that targets or specializes in services for the reentry population. That will be here in Baltimore City and preferably Prince George's County and Hagerstown, where the prison population is migrating and have no place to go. Partnering also with transitional housing for those citizens that are returning. And our last program is we also have a workforce development program in the school system, Baltimore City school system. Our last program is our Haysbert Center, where we support small businesses. And right now we have a partnership with Lendistry and Goldman Sachs, where we are ensuring that these small businesses are getting this second pot of money. As you know, the CARES Act and PPP, when the initial money came out, including ourselves at the Urban League, we were not approved for the first level of funding. You know, that went to a lot of huge corporations, many of them federally on stock trade, multi-million, billion-dollar agencies received that funding. They since returned a lot of that funding. So right now there's still about $120 billion left for small businesses. Unfortunately, all of this money we could not get. Now it's opening and they're changing, you know, different law. That Urban League was very implemented some of these policies, as well as the police reform that was presented to Congress just last week. But we are working with small businesses to get them approved for the PPP loan. We have thus had 3 people in the last week be approved for PPP. So we would like to work with small businesses in supporting them on one-on-one consulting to sustain their business and receive this PPP for them to continue on during these dual pandemics of racial inequality, as well as this pandemic of COVID.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on behalf of the Prince Hall family. We're delighted to have you. We understand that a couple of our panelists are going to have to be leaving us soon. So first we want to go to Senator Cardin for any closing remarks. And again, Senator, on behalf of the Prince Hall family, we just thank you so much for taking time out today.
Well, once again, Terrence, let me thank all of our panelists. It's been, I think, a great discussion. I particularly appreciate the conversations we've had about getting involved. And Aisha is correct. There's a lot that can be done at the county level. The county can lead by example and show us what we can do to really build trust between community and police. And Willie, I think, is absolutely correct when he says it's systemic racism. It's not so much what the police is doing, it's the attitude that we have in our country that has built up over many years. We're not where we want to be. So there are broader issues that we have to work together. And if we join together, we can make change. It was Dr. Martin Luther King told us that each one of us is here for a purpose and each one of us can make a difference. But when we join together, we can bring about change. So I think the opportunity now is for fundamental change in policing in this country, to establish clear standards for how law enforcement needs to deal with communities, and that there needs to be clear understanding that profiling, discriminatory profiling, can have no place, that police are going to be held to a standard of accountability if they cross the line, that we're going to have the data and information so we can evaluate how policing is done, that we as a nation are going to end a lot of the abusive practices, including the excessive use of force, including the chokehold, including no-knock warrants, that we need to then fundamentally change our criminal justice system because it's discriminated against minority communities. Look at who's in our prisons, and we know that we need to continue down this path of reform. But together we can make that change. So I just want to thank you for giving us an opportunity to have this type of discussion. I urge everyone who's on this call to say, look, we can make a difference. Let's stay focused on this and let's get the job. Let's continue down this path of justice.
Thank you so much, Senator. Along those same lines, I want to go to State's Attorney Braveboy. We have a question that basically revolves around videoing the police and the legality of that. That's something that our Grandmaster really hit on in his speech at the Juneteenth event. He mentioned how with the George Floyd situation, we may not even be aware of it, you know, were it not for the young lady who was courageous enough to stand there with the video tape. So we just want to know, you know, what is the legality of that? What should we do, you know, in the event that we are witnessing something of that nature?
Yes, I would say absolutely. You have the right to videotape. Absolutely. What you don't have the right to do, and what I don't suggest doing, is interfering with the police operation that is occurring at the time. So while you have absolutely every right, and I encourage people to videotape interactions that they see, because you never know when that interaction may escalate and there may be questions on the appropriate use of force. And oftentimes you only have the civilian's word against the police officer if that police officer does not have body cam, or if there's no surveillance cameras in the area. So that that video being taped by the civilian may be the only evidence that our office can evaluate to determine whether or not charges are appropriate. So absolutely, we want individuals to videotape, but we definitely want to make sure that they stand in a place that is safe, that's a safe distance away from the police activity, because we don't want them to be accused of interfering with police activity, and for their own personal safety. But I encourage it. I think it's a good thing. I think it's a smart thing. And you're right, we would not be where we are today. The reforms that are being contemplated at the national level, that we're looking at here at the state level, and even at many localities are looking at, would not have occurred but for a civilian pulling out their cell phone and videotaping.
Thank you so much. And another thing that we wanted to follow up on was the Grandmaster's question regarding the Maryland Police Training Commission. As we understand it, that commission is a very powerful commission, because it can make a determination as to whether one can become a police officer or not. And as we understand it, a lot of their practices, may not have the cultural competence, or they may not look at things in a racial equity lens. So what are some things that we can do to impact change, or maybe review that organization and their policies?
Yeah, I think we definitely need to review their standards and probably modernize them. Again, as I mentioned at the outset, policing, and in my case, in prosecution, we have to look at ourselves as problem solvers and not simply as enforcers and punishers. Because when you do that, you actually engage, I think, better with the public, because you are not looking at how many arrests you have. You're looking at how did you make a difference for the community, and even for that individual that you may have to engage with. But that has to be a part of training. Civility has to be a part of training. How you approach a civilian, how that officer approaches a civilian can really dictate how that encounter goes. Now, are there some civilians who, even if you encounter them and you approach them in a professional way, will they, escalate a situation? That happens. So I'm not saying that all civilians are perfect, but what we have seen too much of are routine stops, routine interactions, where because of the way that the officer approaches a civilian, that the interaction starts out negative, often escalates, and turns into a situation where the civilian is charged criminally. And that is what we have to prevent. That's what we have to work against. So ensuring that everyone understands that stats and quotas cannot exist and should not exist, whether it is something that is written into departmental policy or something that is just understood, meaning a culture that says, I need stats, I need arrests, I need the prosecutor to prosecute X number of cases because I want convictions on my cases. That attitude cannot and should not exist in a civil justice system. And so that starts, I believe, as a mandate to me of how that officer is trained, what is acceptable, and what is the culture of those departments. And we do need to change the culture, because oftentimes there is a culture of, I want to move up. And in order to move up, I feel like I need to have a certain number of arrests. I have to show that I'm active, I'm doing something. And that unfortunately puts them in a really bad position when they are interfacing with civilians who may need a different type of approach. So the training academy is important. I think we need to really look at that. I think they need to certainly engage state's attorneys more than probably they do now, because the truth is every case, if it's going to move forward, comes to our office and we make those decisions. And if our values are different than their values, there will probably be tension because we're not necessarily going to try certain cases or move forward on certain types of charges. So I think it's best that everyone understands what a civil policing requires, and so that I think interactions on our streets would be better.
Thank you. And earlier you mentioned a trailblazer who is doing a lot of work on this police reform, and that being Madam Speaker Adrienne Jones. We are happy to say that Madam Speaker Adrienne Jones is a member of the Order of the Eastern Star. As a matter of fact, she's a member of a chapter in Baltimore, Maggie C. Upshur. And that chapter's associate matron, Ms. Shakira Johnson, had a very interesting conversation with me last night regarding community policing. And so that's something I wanted to address with you guys. She mentioned that in her community, they took it upon themselves to schedule a coffee date with the police. It happens, once every few weeks. They meet, they talk about, local issues regarding policing. They know the police by name and those things. And we just want to know, how can we establish some formal structures to where more communities will be encouraged to do that, so that, we know the police are more engaged in our communities and will have better relations with us as a result. State's Attorney, I'll go back to you if possible.
Sure. I know that a lot of communities have like coffee clubs with police officers. Here in Prince George's County, I think all of our majors have like a citizen advisory committee. So they interact and engage with some of our civic leaders. And I think all of that is great. What I think, though, is important is that that we take those relationships on the streets and begin to engage and interact with those who are likely to come into contact in a negative way with police officers. That is our young men, specifically young Black men. It is our homeless population. It is our individuals, because I think it was Willie who mentioned on the front line, the front lines really are the folks in the community, right? They know what's happening in their community. They know the problemed homes. They know the problem children. They know the issues for the business community. They kind of know that, and they navigate that daily. What I think is important is for true community policing, it's not just about having groups of people who are already involved in the community. It's really about how do we engage and interact with folks who are on the streets, who typically are the ones that the police are interacting with negatively or have a negative interaction with, which I think means that we need to do more community walks with our police officers. We need to engage and address people who they would otherwise only be addressing if they were a suspect or someone who they wanted to detain. But instead of that day, that being the goal, because they got a call, that they have an opportunity to engage and interact with that individual on the street, talking to them, asking them a little bit about themselves, letting them know that, look, I don't look at you only as a threat. I don't look at you only as a criminal. I want to understand who you are as a human being. Once our officers really start doing that, I think, again, the interactions will be different. I remember when I was I don't think I was maybe I was a delegate at the time, or maybe I was just in the community, as Willie mentioned. I love serving our community. But I did a ride along with an officer. That officer saw a young man standing on the side of a street corner. And, an officer could have looked at him and said, I think he looks suspicious. I think he may be selling drugs. I think I think he may be a problem. But this officer just wanted to know his name, just wanted to see how he was doing, wanted to know, hey, can I assist you with anything? You need anything? And that young man smiled, engaged that officer. And I don't know why he was there. And it wasn't our job to ask him why he was there. But it was the point that there was an interaction that he got to have with an officer that was positive, that showed care, that showed concern. And so I think especially our young men need to have more of those interactions, those engagements. They are not the ones that are at the coffee club meetings. They are not the ones on the Citizen Advisory Committee, but they are the ones who we absolutely need to hear from, because those are the individuals that are having the negative interactions with police on the streets. So I think that's where, to me, real community policing come in, when we're not just talking to the civic leaders or the community advocates, but we're talking to every single person at that grassroots level.
Okay, thank you so much. And this one, I want to go to our community leaders, the NAACP and the Urban League. I just want to know you guys' stance on the popular term of defund the police. We know that, on its face, it sounds as though, you want to diminish the value of the police. However, that may not be, exactly what it means. I just want to hear, we can start with Mr. Flowers, kind of your opinion on that subject of defunding the police.
Well, I think that the notion of, I think there's been some confusion about that term, and I don't think that the goal is to take money away from the police. I think the conversations to talk about the value of looking at the social determinants of health and all the breakdowns in social determinants of health in communities, and using some of that money to heal those social determinants of health, whether it's education, job opportunities, or whatever. There are many of those that have pitfalls that cause crime. But more importantly, I don't think we just need to talk about defunding the police. If we're going to be provocative with these terms, we need to start talking about defunding an entire criminal justice system, because the criminal justice system is what was empowered with the crime bill. And that goes from the prosecutors to the judges, the jails. In fact, I would say refund the people for all the money that has been put into private prisons. And when we start talking about that, it'll put everything into where it needs to be in the total context. So when we start talking about the details and the billions, trillions that have been made from the prison industrial complex, and that's the end, on down to the prosecutors who are given everything that they need to try a simple drug charge. So a child, 15-year-old, can get 20 years. We need to look at the whole scope. I reinforce that it's not all about the police. It's about the entire system of racism that has been a significant part of this country. And the crime bill is something to look at. If we're gonna talk about defunding, let's talk about the refund that you get from the trillions now that we get every day from the we pay to these the prison industrial complex.
Thank you. And we want to go kind of on the same subject with Ms. Majors about defunding the police.
Hi, I totally agree with Willie wholeheartedly. However, I do think that there is a necessity to defund the police, not specifically. I think there's the need to reallocate funds. There is a ton of officers that their base salary is $56,000, but their take-home salary is $157,000. Triple what their base salary is. So I am 1000% for defunding the police, because I think those funds need to be allocated for different entities that can support our communities. If we think think back to the definition or the purpose of police, we are well aware that police were formed as slave catchers. And they're resorting back to that same type of behavior. For me, when you defund the police and you reallocate funds, then you put funds where they need to go. We have several police officers that are called to domestic situations. I think those type of situations can be reallocated where you work with an entity that has experience and specific training in domestic violence. When you have a situation where there's a mental health issue, we don't have another person killed because the police cannot identify that there's a mental crisis taking place, where we need to have individuals from chronic BCAR, someone from a crisis intervention, to come and support that situation. We have Karens and Connors, or Kevin, I don't know what they call them. But when you have those type of calls, when Karen calls because someone has pissed her off in the parking lot, you know, those are situations that can be de-escalated from individuals that are trained in that area. Our police are very much inequipped to do a lot of the work they're doing. A lot of times you may see a police officer sitting because they saw a baby in the street. They have no idea how to handle individuals that are homeless, how to handle food insecurities. So when I look at defunding the police, I look at reallocation of funds, taking away from those triple overtimes and using that into services that will support youth that are re-entering into society, to work with the re-entry population, that this population is not only dealing with the police officers that they sometimes believe put them there, but will work with the entity that will help them sustain their lives and have that ability to succeed. Defunding the police is probably the first thing we need to do, as well as reform the policies. It's a whole systems change. As he said, we need to change the whole system. The system is completely broken, and it seems like we're going back to the very state and root of why police, you know, were formed to catch us, and they're catching us. Karen is catching us, Kevin, Colin, everybody is catching us doing everything. So
Tiffany, let me help Tiffany. Tiffany is gonna have to be careful with the Karens and those terms.
No, I'm serious.
Well, she brought up a good point. I'm a runner, and I manage 2 races. One is in the city, in Baltimore City, and one is Howard County. I had to stop doing the one in the city because it's a 5K race. It might take us an hour and a half to do the race, maybe. And I had to pay $8,000 in police overtime to host that race. And because of that, I had to stop doing it because, you know, you start off in the hole, right? The race in Howard County, I don't have to pay anything at all. I think it's the same case in Baltimore County, and it's probably the same situation in Prince George's County. But to her point, that police, you know, I guess they have to be incentivized to make money, and they wait for these opportunities to make money, but the policy is there for them to do it. So I don't blame the police for wanting to get opportunities to make, as she said, $100,000 on a $50,000 base pay. It's the policies, and there's nothing that comes back. Our goal was to market health and fitness in the community and raise money for our organization. We couldn't do that because it was too expensive because of this policy, and those things need to be looked at too. Since we're talking about the provocative nature of defunding, we just need to look at the policies along with it.
Thank you. And State's Attorney Braveboy, I understand you have to go, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to address the defund the police thing, and also, you know, just any closing comments that you may have.
I'd ask if you would also add, your counterpart in Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, has said that we need to reimagine policing in the 21st century. And along those lines, she has decided not to prosecute certain cases. If you could address that and what's happening in Prince George's County with your office.
Sure, absolutely. Well, let me just first say that, you know, again, it was an honor to be a part of this very distinguished panel. With respect to the defund the police movement, which I think really is about reallocating funds that our taxpayers provide to us in a way that is most effective in our communities, that makes a lot of sense, the reallocation part of it. And as I started the conversation earlier, police and prosecutors, and we had already started this in our office, we see ourselves as problem solvers, not merely administrators of justice and punishment. I mean, we certainly administer justice, but we also can solve problems that may not require an individual come into the justice system or remain in the justice system. Similarly, police have to also see themselves that way. They have to see themselves as problem solvers, where arrest is maybe a response, appropriate response to certain interactions, but in other interactions, it may be, getting that person the help that they need, which would then require the community to be able to have certain services that are needed, like mental health services, like addiction services, like educational services and job training services and mentoring programs and other what I call a real social safety net that is needed in our communities. And so funding that traditionally have gone to potentially overtime or other type of policing activities could be redirected, especially if our system of justice is about only really focusing on holding those, accountable criminally that are committing the more serious crimes in our community, and not criminalizing people because of their addictions, because of their status as a homeless person, because of mental health issues and other factors. And if we began to look at our system of justice in that way, and players like me, the prosecutor, and also the police department believe that they have resources that they can access in the community to assist people who they engage with, I think we would all be in a better place. Most officers will tell you they are not necessarily interested in arresting everyone, but they have very few options because they're often called by business owners, by community members who are upset about something occurring in their community. So they are being brought to situations where people want oftentimes some type of justice or some type of punishment to happen to that individual. That's often what they're called. And so their response is oftentimes to detain the person or to arrest that person. And they don't have that option right now. If there's someone who is homeless, they don't take them to a homeless shelter, but maybe that's what we should be able to do for that individual. If we know someone has a mental health issue, oftentimes it's the police responding, and maybe we need to have a mobile, and this is what I'm proposing here in Prince George's County, a mobile mental health crisis team that can also respond to those situations, so that we're not escalating people who are in crisis, but that we are giving them the support that they need to de-escalate whatever that situation is. And then we can direct them to the appropriate care provider. Like that is that's the hard work that we need to do. That's where we need to invest our resources. But that is not simply the police, because the police have very limited jurisdiction. They have very limited resources. They only have the resources that the county governments give them, okay? So everything that they get is because the county has determined that the taxpayer money should be used in this way. If we begin to say, police, we understand that you have a job to do. We want you to keep our streets safe, but we are also providing some other options for you so that arrest and charging are not the only options for certain types of offenses, then that to me is a much better scenario to put that officer in. Now, with respect to our office and what we do, yes, we have decided, and we work with our police department, and we let them know when we are not prosecuting certain types of cases. So certainly our minor, marijuana possession cases, we don't prosecute anymore. The prostitution cases we have had for the past about almost a year now, what's called a prostitution or a commercial sex work diversion program, where individuals who may be arrested are triaged and put into one of 3 programs that we have partnered with in our community to assist those individuals to gain job training, skill development, mentorship, so that they can make other choices with their life. Similarly, we're in the process of developing a homeless diversion program. Again, those who are charged with 4th degree burglaries, which again is breaking into an unoccupied space, and trespassing. Oftentimes those individuals are homeless or have other issues. And so instead of charging them and prosecuting them, it makes more sense to again triage them and put them into programs that can assist and take care of their social, emotional, and financial needs, so that we don't see them over and over again in our criminal justice system. So there are a lot of things that we divert most of our low-level offenses already. We don't prosecute them, but we do have programs. We have programs for people who write bad checks. We have programs for low-level theft crimes. We have programs for individuals who commit very minor offenses in our community, but if not addressed, they could potentially escalate. And so that's kind of our concern, is not the minor crime. Is this indicative of, is this a gateway crime that you're engaged in now and that could escalate in the future? And sometimes that the answer is no. They're committing, trespassing because they're homeless, and so they're not going to do anything else probably. But we want to give people the tools that they need to be successful in life. And so that's what our office does now. We've been doing that for the past 18 months, and since I've been state's attorney, and it's been very successful. So we don't prosecute a great deal of our low-level, misdemeanor cases for that very reason. And we for a very long time.
Thank you so much, State's Attorney, and thank you again for joining us today. We're very excited to have you and your perspective on this.
Absolutely.
So moving forward with the panel, we just want to discuss promotional opportunities. So one of the issues with policing and community policing happens to be the fact that many of us discuss how quite often the police don't necessarily look like us. And when they do, they remain low level. So we have situations where they can't get the promotions as easy because the people making the decisions don't necessarily look at those decisions with a racial equity lens. So what are some things that we can do for our police officers of color to ensure that they are getting promoted and they are getting the necessary things that they need? We can start with Mr. Flowers.
Well, the work that we've done, I've had the opportunity to, one of our members is a retired officer. So I've been a little exposed to the process for promotion in the Howard County Police. And it's not to say it's complicated, but it is strenuous. You have to stay on top of your studies. A lot of it is academic, but the other is a matter of commitment and your attitude toward leadership and how you want to retire. And what I've seen them do, there's a police union, and then the African American police union is called the Centurions for Justice. And they basically support, mentor, and guide police who want to be in leadership and move toward promotions. And I've seen that. Hopefully that's the same case in other areas. But I think that the whole mentorship thing is important. And it's the commitment. I mean, an individual has to be dedicated to their own success and an effort to be promoted in order to play at that level. So I can't really speak to anything, I can only speak to what I've been exposed to. But, and then, I mean, the example of that in Howard County is that we have an African-American female chief of police, and Chief Lisa Myers, who is a person who not only did she go through that process, but she mentored other people.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers. And I want to ask a quick question to Ms. Majors. Do you think that a reallocation of funds would assist with the Urban Leagues program and mission?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We provide different services that, as Mr. Flower said, or Aisha said, they're just not trained to do. You know, we're expecting them to do too much. We're expecting them to do things that they were not trained for. If they reallocate funds programs, we're looking to start a diversion program as well for youth that have re-entered back into society for workforce development. So yeah, absolutely. If the reallocation of funds is supported, it would support many other organizations, many small nonprofits and grassroots organizations in Baltimore City that specifically work with youth. I know when I was growing up back home, we had the PAL. That was a big thing for us. I played basketball for PAL, and our police officers were friends. They would drop us off. It would be no problem working with the police. We had great relationships with the police. But unfortunately, you know, working in Baltimore City, there's just a total different outlook, and not necessarily from the police, from the youth. You know, the vision of what they believe the police do and what their purpose is totally different than what's actually going on. We need a position where we can have those type of relationships again, where you have the police that are working in mentoring programs with different nonprofit and small organizations up in the communities, where you have the police officer, like you said, you know, not necessarily officer friendly, but is in the community that's taking time, you know, if they give them the overtime to go play basketball with them, or to play football, or to train them on something, to teach them how you can be the proper police officer. Police officers are to serve, you know, they don't, people don't even realize that they serve us, you know. But you don't get that visual from youth or from our inner city communities. The question you asked, Mr. Flowers, I really couldn't answer because I work primarily with Baltimore City, and I have so many friends, both female and male, Black, that are in high leadership positions in Baltimore City. I don't really know, you know, how that works. I know two of my friends that are majors. She's been an officer for 25 years. I don't know if it really takes that long to get there, and it had to do with gender and race, but I do have quite a few friends that are in leadership positions in Baltimore City Police. But I think, I know that if you reallocate this large, you know, I don't know if you saw the graph that was going around, I put it on our page, but you could see a certain portion of the budget where the police budget was all the way down here for like 56 million. And then it was like here for education, and then some other things that made no sense for nonprofits or civil rights organizations where there's a serious need right now. There was almost $0. Personally, we don't receive funding from the city, not so much the state either, to support our programs. So it's imperative that we have reallocation so that we can support the city in moving forward. It's not just a lot of you know, lip work, but we're actually really supporting each other. We're there to support the police officers and the city as a whole. Funding would definitely support that. My funding does not come from the city government services. All of our funding comes from personal donations, philanthropy, and corporations like banks. But we don't get any support for our youth programs. That is the top youth program running for at least 7 years. We don't get $1 for that program or any support.
Let's change that.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. So we are having great weigh-in online. We want to keep that discussion going. So please continue to send your comments. We see a lot of great ideas about community policing, a lot of questions. We can't get to them all, brothers and sisters. We thank you. for joining in. But at this moment, we're going to go to our most worshipful Grand Master for his comments and to begin to close us out. So without further ado, the Honorable Emmanuel J. Stanley.
Thank you, Terrence. I want to say thank you to our panelists. I really appreciate the great work that you're doing in your various areas of responsibility. Your commitment to the communities in which you serve is obvious, and your reputations precede you. So again, I say thank you and I applaud you for all your great efforts. I know that oftentimes you don't get the well-deserved pat on the back, but your efforts are appreciated and you are making great differences and changes within our community. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to speak to what Willie talked about in his opening statements. We have an issue in this nation that we have yet to address adequately. At no time has the US Congress come together for both houses to formally apologize for the immoral actions associated with slavery. At no time has a US president stood before the nation and apologized to 40 million people who are descendants of those who survived the Middle Passage and then had to endure all of the ills associated with slavery. We must have that conversation as a nation. I predict that during this election cycle that there will be a blue wave, and undoubtedly, if the Democrats are able to take control of the Senate as well as the White House, there will be some changes. Unfortunately, Senator Cardin is not on, still on this forum, but I would say to him that what was normal is no longer acceptable. The lip service, the substandard passage of laws, the changings of policies which barely address the true issues at hand is unacceptable. And I think that the nation is showing us that. The protests will continue, not only in the United States, but across the world. And the truth be told, it all stems back to white supremacy. And you can name that in every one of the major nations on this earth. They all benefited from that immoral practice. It has been stated in many news sources over the last 6 to 8 weeks that the recent stimulus bills represented the greatest redistribution of wealth in this nation's history. I beg to differ. From 1619, from when the first slaves came to the shores of Virginia, until 1863 with the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and then 100 years after that of Jim Crow, redlining, and other discriminatory practice in this nation, represents 400 years of redistribution of wealth to a people. In 1860, the slave trades were estimated to be $3 billion that the slave traders made in profit. You multiply that by 400 years. I think that when the Democrats take over, God willing, that there will be true legislation that comes forward. We have to talk about reparations. We have to talk about equaling the playing field. To our white friends, I would say that whenever there's an injustice, you're able to go to the courts and you are made whole, not just by prosecuting someone and placing them behind bars, but you are made whole financially. There's been no economic justice for the African American. We've been marginalized for far too long. So I say to my brothers and sisters, go to the polls, but go to the polls with a purpose this time. Understand your role to cast a ballot for the candidate of your choice, but then to hold them accountable to do what it is that you want them to do. Ms. Major said that the police work for us. The entire government works for us. They are to do what it is that we want. but only if we assert ourselves. We have to stand in the gap. It is unfair for us in this generation to allow this to go on another day. I don't want my children or my children's children dealing with issues that should have been addressed hundreds of years ago. So we have a responsibility today, right now, to reach out to those who we have empowered and tell them what it is that we want. And we must do so boldly. Contrary to popular belief, we do not have to make the president feel good in order for him to sign legislation. We do not have to make the governor feel good in order for him to sign legislation, nor any of our elected officials. Their job is not for us to make them feel good. Their job is to make us feel good if they want to retain their positions. We have to recognize our power. We have to understand that with that power comes great responsibility. That means that we must show up at the polls, but we must go to city council meetings. We must go to county council meetings. We must be at school superintendent meetings. We have to be there consistently. We have to support organizations like the Urban League and the NAACP, but not only with our time and our talents, but with our treasures. We have to sow a seed into these organizations if we are to improve. And lastly, we have to work collaboratively. We cannot have different agendas. They should all coincide with one goal and one initiative, and that's to raise our people. So I'm calling upon all Masons and all Eastern Stars. I'm calling upon all those who have been marginalized and undervalued to stand up and to take notice, to take interest of what's going on. We have been blessed during this pandemic. You may not understand what I'm saying. We don't have the distraction of sports. We don't have the distractions that normally keep us from focusing on what is of value. If you don't want your child or your friend's child or that neighbor who you don't even know child to be impacted by police brutality, you have to pay attention to everything that's going on. And so I'm urging you to get serious. Our people depend on you. Our future is depending upon what you do today. So I thank you for your time. I appreciate everyone that participated in this forum, and those that viewed us and those that were listening. I pray God's blessings upon each of you. And I pray God's blessings upon this nation because we need it. Thank you, Terrence.